Okay, what I have to start with tonight is, talked about this last week. Hey, Jamie. We talked about this last week where Jesus, he called Philip, asked Philip to come, and then Philip went and got Nathanael. And let me read this account so we're up to speed with it. The next day, he, Jesus, supposed to go forth into Galilee, and he found Philip. And this is from John 1:43 through 51. He found Philip and said, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, of the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said to him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." Jesus answered and said to him, "Because I said to you that I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You shall see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you shall see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Now, what I want us to look at before we go on to the other Gospels and the calling of the five, I wanted to come back to this fig tree. We discussed it a little bit last week, and we pointed out that for Nathanael, him sitting under the fig tree, it was possible that sitting there praying, and as possibly as a disciple, and that one of the things that the disciples did when they prayed, they would go to the fig tree, get under the fig tree, and they would pray, and they were instructed that their prayer had to include a prayer asking God to send the Messiah. So if in fact Nathanael was under the fig tree praying that the Messiah would come, Philip comes to him and says, "I found the Messiah." So it had to be interesting for him. But then Philip says, it's Jesus from Nazareth, and Nathanael goes through his little routine. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? But I want to focus on this fig tree a little bit. The fig tree was an unusual tree. And let's see if I want to read this, Mark 11. Not yet. The fig tree, doing a little research on the fig tree is one that the fruit comes out before the leaves. It produces the fruit and then the leaves. So I guess we can assume if Nathanael was sitting under a fig tree, it probably had leaves, and hopefully it had some fruit. Jesus says, "I saw you when you were under the fig tree." And if Nathanael was praying while under the fig tree, it could be assumed that he was praying for the coming Messiah. So then Philip comes and gets him, and then when Jesus says, "I saw you under the fig tree," he immediately assumes only the Messiah would have known I was there without being able to see me. So I want to look at this fig tree. I think there's more to it than what we see. We could easily say, well, yeah, he was sitting under a tree. It's kind of customary. If you want to get out of the sun, you get under a tree. But I think there's a real significance to the fig tree. Let's look at this story, and I think I have the right passage here. Mark 11, and this is after Jesus had talked to Philip and Nathanael, and let's pick up in chapter 11 in Mark. What I want, verse 12. And the next day, when they had departed from Bethany, he became hungry. And seeing at a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see, perhaps there would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season of figs. And he answered and said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples were listening. And they came to Jerusalem. So he sees this fig tree. He's hungry. Says, I think I'll go get some fruit. He goes there. There's no fruit, but there's leaves. So we see the thing that it produces the fruit and then the leaves. So if the tree had only leaves, it's very possible it was either not the season as it says, or maybe it was a barren tree that didn't produce any fruit. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to cast out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry goods through the temple. When he says he wouldn't permit anybody to carry goods through the temple was so huge in Jerusalem, taking so many blocks. Oftentimes, people coming into the city would go through the temple to get to, say, some of the marketplaces instead of going all the way around. So Jesus was stopping them from carrying goods through the temple. And he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, my house is a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a robber's den? And the chief priests and the scribes heard this and began seeking how to destroy him, for they were afraid of him, for all the multitude were astonished at his teachings. And whenever evening came, they would get out of the city. And as they were passing by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. So this is the fig tree that Jesus cursed because there was no fruit on it. Being reminded, Peter said to him, Rabbi, behold, the fig tree which you cursed has withered. And Jesus answered and said to him, have faith. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it shall be granted him. Therefore I say to you, all things for which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they shall be granted you. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if there is anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father who is in heaven forgive you your trespasses. So, why would he curse a fig tree? Because there was no fruit. He goes into the city, chases all of the merchants and money changers out of the city, and then when he's coming back the next day, that fig tree has withered up. So Peter says, look at the fig tree. So what's Jesus' response to him? He says to him, he doesn't say anything about the fig tree. He just says, have faith in God. And he tells about the moving of, if you had the faith of a mustard seed, you could move this mountain. And as I looked at this, I'm thinking, okay, what does that have to do with a fig tree? What does that have to do with a fig tree? The fig tree produces the fruit first. So the fruit in our lives should become evident before the leaves of our lives become evident. And the leaves would be the dressing, the trimming that's on our walk as Christians. We can go through the motions, we can be look respectful at church, and we can do certain things, but if the fruit is not producing in our lives, that's what Jesus is trying to say. Remember, he just went to the temple, chased out everyone who was not there for a purpose of sacrifice or honoring God. They were in there with all their trappings and all their designs. They had all the leaves of a fig tree, but they had none of the fruit. And he's saying, if you have faith, as the size of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, be removed. He's not talking about moving a mountain. He's talking about the faith in God that he comes to this. If we forgive others, our Father will forgive us. So he's talking about the fruit in our lives, like we are a fig tree. If we produce the fruit, then the decorations and the trimmings come later, and that fruit will produce that faith and that obedience to him through us. But we so often get caught up in all the trimmings that we miss the fruit. And that's what he was saying to them in the temple. You guys have all the trappings. You're selling the doves, you're making money change, you got people coming through with merchandise. You're doing everything except what you were here to do, and that's to produce fruit and honor God. So it just seemed a little strange that this fig tree just kind of got thrown in there in the middle of this story. But I think what it is, that producing fruit in our lives should come long before all these trappings and all these other things. And when we read that, oftentimes all we focus is on him saying you could move a mountain. We think, okay, what kind of faith would that be? But he's just saying that we need to be producing the fruit of forgiveness in our lives, which may be a mountain for some of us. And so if you take a symbolism of a mountain, of something that's blocking your way, you either have to go around it, or if you have the faith, and in this case, the faith that he's talking about is the faith of being forgiving to others and your Father forgiving to you, then that mountain is moved. And you could apply that mountain to any obstacle that's in your way. Okay. Any thoughts or questions on that? I think it gives a little more purpose to that passage than just him withering a fig tree. When I first read it, I thought, okay, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But it fit within the context of everything that John is saying there, that there is an element where we need to be producing fruit before we produce all of the trappings and everything that goes with that. Okay? This is the other reference. Matthew gives the same account of Jesus cursing the fig tree, and it's within that same time frame. Okay, let's real quick. We'll go through the other Gospels. Remember, we use Luke as a base as to where we project out our story from, and we'll do this quickly. And we're going to look at Mark. This is Mark's account of him selecting the first disciples. And then we're going to look at Matthew. I don't think we touched these last week. Did we get through Mark and Matthew on the picking of the 5 first ones? Okay, so we got to 2. We got John and Luke. So, my trusty Bible here. Mark chapter 1. And remember, we're looking at these to see the difference in the way each of the gospel writers presents the same story. That's one of the things that we were doing in our parallel paper. And from this, we hope to see a concise picture of how things went. And knowing the writers, then we might be able to determine what perspective they presented their story and the way they presented it. Mark chapter 1. Verse 16. And as he was going along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And they immediately left their nets and followed him. And going a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, who were also in the boats mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and went away to follow him. And they went to Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach. So we don't have our examples from last week, but the four disciples mentioned in Mark's account are Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And I think we did notice last week when we looked at the account in John, when John talks about himself, he doesn't mention his own name. He just says the other disciple, so he's talking about himself. And like I say, just a real quick thought on the Mark account. When you read this, if you've not looked at the other Gospels and their account, you think that Jesus happened to be walking by the sea and he sees these four guys and he says, "Follow me." Will they follow him? But we know that's not the case, because when we looked at John, he saw these same men when he was down in Judea. Now he's up in Galilee after doing some preaching there. Now he sees them again in Mark's account in Galilee, where in John's account they were in Judea when he saw them. They were probably there for one of the festivals, and he saw them. And I think two of them, John and James, were disciples of John the Baptist when he saw them. So I say that so we can see that just reading one account, we might lose some of the emphasis of the story. So they were with Jesus prior to this, and maybe they went back to their fishing for a short time until he came again. He said, "Okay, now follow me." So it makes a little more sense that just come follow me, that they drop everything and follow him. The idea is that they more than likely knew him from John's account, which was, I don't know if it was a full year earlier, but it was earlier. Okay? And in Matthew's account, and as you do more study in these, you'll find that the stories will blend together, but you'll start to detect that personality of the writer. And then that will enable you to pull things out of a story that normally you would just read right past. So Matthew 4:18. And walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting their nets into the sea, for they were fishermen. Same story that Mark gives, same location. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And they immediately left the nets and followed him. And going on from there, he also saw the two brothers, James and the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. And he called them, and they immediately left the boat and their father and followed him. So I think we can take from that, as we look at these two accounts, and then we go back and we look at John's account, Jesus had interaction with these disciples prior to this account. So the accounts in here make it more like, okay, he knew him. He said, "Hey, come follow me." Well, they had already had interaction with him, even to the effect that I think it was in John, they left Judea, went up to a wedding in Cana, and it says Jesus and the disciples were invited. So they were traveling with him up to that point. At some point, they got over to the Sea of Galilee and were back. Jesus came again, and he says, "Okay, now follow me." And probably from that point on, they did not depart from him. They stayed with him. Okay? So just give you a couple observations that I had about this selection. And I'll give you the references where he selected the rest of the disciples. Something about the disciples that I picked up. He said, each of the disciples, each of the first disciples, as well as those called later, left everything to follow Jesus. They were not rich, well educated, or even in a place of authority. Remember when Jesus preached in his hometown of Nazareth, he quoted Isaiah 61, I've come for the poor, the downtrodden, the cast out, the prison, those in prison. Well, these men were lowly fishermen. They had no money, they had no authority, had no teaching, and those were the ones that he called. He didn't call the rich, he didn't call the well-educated, or even those in authority. The only person I could see that maybe had some authority might have been Levi. He was a tax collector. So, he had some authority, although there was no prestige with that job. Even today, we don't care for IRS men. For the most part, tax collectors were despised and thought of as traitors because they worked for Rome, who had Israel in bondage. Although they did give Israel a lot of freedom, but they had them in bondage. And then the other thing about these disciples, we only have a limited account in the Bible of their lives after Jesus' departure. Some of the disciples, you hear their names mentioned when they were selected and pretty much don't hear their names again. You have to kind of hunt for them to find who the 12 were. But history tells us all 12, with the exception of John, died a martyr's death for their faith. So even though we don't have an account of them in the Gospels, we have a historical account that shows that they stayed true to them being disciples of Jesus, because before their, not before their end, but their lives were end as a result of being martyred. And it followed the teaching of Jesus until their deaths. And then just a little application I put here. How much is asked of us? Jesus asked nothing less of us than he did these disciples. Each of us, at our particular season in our lives, is asked to give all to him, just as the disciples were. And I'm not saying quit your jobs and start following Jesus, but evaluate what season are you in your life and what things are you ready to relinquish to pursue after him. And the two important things, and you can consider these, the two important things about the disciples that made them special. It wasn't their jobs, it wasn't their trade, it wasn't their abilities, it wasn't their wealth or their authority. The two things that made them exceptional was that they were called by Jesus and they responded. And we each have that call. Now, are we going to respond to that call? And then the rest of the disciples, if you want a record or you want an account of where all 12 were selected, it's Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16. And the same account is in Matthew 10, 1 through 4. He lists all 12 of the disciples. It seems as if Jesus had a lot of disciples, a lot of people following him. There's a reference to him sending 72 of them out to do preaching and so forth. And then in this account in Luke, it says, well, let's read it real quick. Luke chapter 6. And I hope you can see that this brings a lot of it together, even though the gospel writers didn't put it in the same order that we would like it to be in, but with a little research you can find it. And this is Luke chapter 6, verse 12. And it was at this time that he went off to the mountains to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples to him, and he chose 12 of them, who he also named apostles. So it's like at this point, there were a lot of disciples. Now he selects 12, and he gives them a title of apostle. And then if you want to go ahead and make note there, he he named all 12 of them. And like I say, for some, that's the only time you ever hear their name mentioned in the scriptures. Okay? All right, let me stop this for a second, and we'll switch gears. Okay, what we want to do now is look at the Sermon on the Mount. Now, it's when you look at Luke's account, he does it in one chapter. When you look at Matthew's account, he goes from chapter 5 through chapter 7. It's a very long sermon. The first thing we want to look at when we look at these, and remember, as I keep repeating myself, but we're using Luke as our basis for our study, and then we're branching out to the other Gospels to see how they coincide with that. So in Luke's account, it says, when Jesus, and I'm going to read the beginning of this. When he started this sermon, it says, he stood on a level place. And Matthew says he went up on a mountain. Thus the Sermon on the Mount, as many call it. So, I guess the first thing we might want to do is work on this seemingly contradiction. Luke says he stood on a level place. And let's get to the Luke chapter 6. Verse 1, it says, now it came about that on a certain he was passing through some grain field. Let me make sure I didn't turn that off. Passing through some grain fields, and his disciples were picking and eating the heads of the grain, rubbing them in their hands. And let me jump down a bit. I think I might have I'm sorry. 17. No wonder I'm not reading the right thing. Okay. We'll start here. This is where it describes the location from Luke. 6, verse 17. And he descended with them and stood on a level place. And there was a great multitude of his disciples and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal regions of Tyre and Sidon, and who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured. And all the multitudes were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing all. Okay, so Luke says he was standing on a level place. Let's look at Matthew's real quick. I'm hoping it starts right at the beginning. Yeah. Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. And he saw the multitude, and he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him and opened his mouth, and then he started to preach to them. So how do you think, and I don't want us to approach the scriptures looking for discrepancies, but they're there. So I think it's a challenge, not a challenge so much, but it's a way for us to do research. When we see things that maybe just don't line up exactly, that's the time we say, okay, let me see if I can figure this out. And as we do that, we build a knowledge of the scriptures, and we become not only more familiar with them, but we become familiar with the writers. So anybody want to take a shot at how he could be on a level place and on a mountain at the same time? Pretty easy solution, and I had time to think about it.
Well, it could be on a mountain, on the top of a mountain, but it could be a level place.
Yes. Yeah, it could be a plane on the top of the mountain. Room. I mean, if he was on the top of the mountain, there wouldn't be any place for anybody to sit if it was not at a level place.
Right.
So I just pointed it out so that you can see. Sometimes it seems like an inconsistency, but it's really not when you think it through. So verse 17 of Luke, he's saying it's on a level place, and Matthew, verse 1, he says it's on a mountain. So not so much a contradiction, but just a little different.